A few months back, I reviewed an MSI gaming monitor that had a pretty unique proposition. A 26.5-inch flat glossy QD OLED panel with a resolution of 4K and a refresh rate of 240Hz. Why am I mentioning it? Because the monitor we have on review today, the AOC Agon Pro AG276UZD, has pretty much the near identical specifications, and yet it comes in at a cheaper price point. See, the AOC was released at roughly £700 and now can be found for £600, while the MSI cost £1,000 and can now be found for £700. So yes, what we have on review today actually still undercuts its main rival. Now in this review you can see if it's actually worth its price tag and of course how it performs across the board and if it's something that you should buy over the likes of this MSI gaming monitor that I previously reviewed. Now before jumping into this video, I would just like to point out that if you do want to get it from Amazon, make sure you check it out in the links down description below or in the pinned comments or by scanning the QR code that can be found on your screen right now. So to kick things off, let's talk about its input lag, and here it's extremely impressive. Indeed, while playing a game such as Counter-Strike 2, I had no issues when it came to registering my mouse inputs. Sure enough, I don't really know why someone would play a game such as Counter-Strike 2 on a 4K 240Hz monitor, but nonetheless, when it came to my own subjective testing and my own sort of benchmarks, I actually found it to be really good. And the same sort of comments could be said about a lot of the modern monitors that I've tested to date, including its MSI counterpart. Now it is worth highlighting over here that these comments were said with the low input lag mode enabled by the monitor's OSD. If you were to enable adaptive sync technologies, such as Nvidia G-Sync or AMD FreeSync, it will grey out the option but have it enabled. Although I did find it to have a slight odd behavior, namely if you're connected over HDMI and for some reason you've selected the console/DVD mode. This will lock you out of the low input lag mode and will also disable it if you have adaptive sync technologies disabled, which is quite baffling. In fact, if you want a little bit of an explanation of this, make sure you check out the linked video that can be found up on your pop-up banner or down in the description below. Now, aside from the slight anomaly when it comes to the low input lag mode, we should talk about its overall response time. And given this monitor has got a QD-OLED panel, it should come as almost no surprise that it does do a stonkingly good job. Now at 240Hz, you'll be able to see at the bottom left-hand side of your screen the average initial time, which translates to the average D/G which most manufacturers claim. And here it's sat at a stonkingly low 0.68 milliseconds, with the percent in window sitting at 100%. Yes, indeed, it is hitting all those 240Hz frames and transitions, and therefore means that when it comes to getting the best sort of experience that one can get, this OLED does indeed perform as you might come to expect. Now furthermore, when it comes to the overall visual experience, here you'll be able to see the UFO ghosting test. Indeed identical to what I noticed on the MSI gaming monitor, in that it does do a decent job at 240Hz. Although it is worth mentioning that there is no sort of motion blur reduction technology, MBR for short, like you'd find on certain other OLEDs out there, albeit at a different resolution and refresh rate, and of course regular LCD monitors, in other words IPS VA or TNs. MBR would have been appreciated as it would have given you an even more clear image. But frankly, given the overall target demographic that I suspect of this 4K 240Hz monitor, well, I've got no complaints whatsoever. And it's good to see you've got no sort of inverse ghosting or anything like that to worry about, because of course, again, we're talking about an OLED. Now before moving on, I would just like to point out that outputting 240Hz consistently at 4K is near on impossible, at least in my opinion, even with the most beefiest graphics card available. This is something worth pointing out, simply because if you're looking at this monitor, you're likely going to be playing AAA games or visually impactful games, and therefore hitting that 240Hz might be a little bit hard. Nonetheless, it's good to see you've got that overall headroom with this monitor, and of course somewhat future-proofing it with other technologies that might come out in the near future with graphics card manufacturers. Moving swiftly on, we get onto adaptive sync technologies, and here you've got a VRR range from 48 up to 240Hz. Now this means that you can run Nvidia G-Sync or AMD FreeSync. I was able to test the former because I've got an RTX 3080. And when connected over HDMI or DisplayPort, and yes, that's because you've got full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports, it means that you can run the likes of the Nvidia Pendulum demo. And in my case, I didn't encounter any sort of black screen issues. although very much like a lot of OLEDs out there, there was some VRR flicker. This is present when you're on lower frames or indeed static frames. Not something that really bothers me, namely when you're going to be playing a game. However, it's just something I thought I should highlight, especially if you've got quite sensitive eyes. Now, in terms of playing a game, I went ahead and used Destiny 2 as my benchmark, because here I was able to run 4K, 240Hz with NVIDIA G-Sync enabled, and also HDR. Yes, indeed, all the technologies worked in tandem without any sort of hitches. Now, in terms of the overall HDR reproduction, it's absolutely phenomenal. Not only because you've got a glossy panel, but also thanks to the fact that you have got DisplayHDR True Black 400 certification. In other words, you're getting really good, rich colors and a fantastic contrast, which is thanks to the fact that you've got that OLED panel technology. Now, this will limit the brightness at roughly 400 nits, but I did find it to be perfectly acceptable and plentiful while playing a game such as Destiny 2. Now, if you do want higher brightness that can go up to nearly 1000 nits, so therefore almost 2.5 times more, then you can do so by going into one of the other HDR modes that can be selected via the monitor's OSD, for example, the HDR Peak mode. And this will effectively give you much higher brightness, all while sacrificing the overall color accuracy and the extra pop that you'll get in your image. Now, this does actually perfectly lead me onto console gaming, because yes, indeed, over here you can feed through AMD FreeSync via the HDMI port and also utilize 4K at 120Hz, which is very much appreciated. Now here, I was able to put it through its paces using the OSRTD tool. And at 120Hz, it hit a perfect 100% in window with the average initial time, in other words, the average G2G, sitting at 0.65 milliseconds. The same sort of comments could be said at 60Hz with the average initial time sitting at just 0.63 milliseconds. So yes, indeed, it does a stunningly good job across the board, as you might expect for an OLED. Yet again, over here, you've got no sort of inverse ghosting to worry about. And in terms of the overall motion clarity, well, it's pretty much acceptable and on par with what you might expect at its refresh rate range. Again, as I did mention before, it's a shame there's no MBR technology, which would have given you a better sort of motion clarity. So its overall gaming performance is really impressive, but what about when it comes to its image quality? Well, as a reminder, you've got a flat 26.5-inch glossy QD-OLED panel that runs at 4K up to 240Hz. In terms of the overall text clarity, well, it's pretty pinpoint and sharp because you've got that extra pixel density thanks to that smaller form factor at that higher resolution. Now, in terms of the overall colors, it's good to see that you've got a few different modes you can select via the monitor's OSD. And here we're going to concentrate on the sRGB mode because I suspect that's the one that most people will utilize. Here it's good to see that you've got full brightness controls. And in using my calibrators, I noticed a gamma coverage of 95.7% and a gamma volume of 98.6%. Below you can see how it compares to the standard. The average delta sits at a pretty impressive 1.49 and a maximum of 3.06. I'm sure with a bit of tuning it can actually get a little bit tighter. In other words, over here it can still be used for serious image editing work or video grading right out the box. Its tested contrast ratio sits at infinity to 1, given it's an OLED panel, and its measured white point in comparison to the 6504 Kelvin target sits at a pretty respectable 6215 Kelvin at 100%. As for its gamma curve, you'll be able to see how it compares to the 2.2 standard, and what I'll say is that it does have a slight odd tail off towards the higher brightness levels. Not something that actually bothered me in practice, but just something I thought I should highlight. Now, should you not be editing in the sRGB color space, I'd suggest going out of this mode. For example, the DCI-P3 or the panel native modes. Here the latter is suggested as it gives you even more control. And this means that it will give you extra little bit of pop in your image and therefore be appreciated if you're using this monitor for multimedia consumption or of course gaming. Now, aside from this, we should talk about its overall brightness. And here in HDR, I clocked in a peak of 981 nits. However, in the DisplayHDR mode, it sits at 401 nits, which is exactly what it's rated for. Similarly over here, in terms of its SDR brightness, it gets at a peak of 251 nits, and its minimum brightness does get all the way down to 20 nits. In other words, in HDR, this monitor does get plenty bright, and in SDR, it's perfectly acceptable, although you're probably going to want to use it at 70 to 90% brightness in a bright sunlit room. And here, if you're going to be using it in a completely pitch black environment, it does get actually pretty dim. Now, as for its overall brightness uniformity, you'll be able to see how my test with panel performed across the board, which I do appreciate is somewhat panel lottery. It didn't do a tremendous job, however, it's still perfectly acceptable, and therefore will be appreciated by editors. In terms of the overall backlight bleed, well, it's non-existent, thanks to the fact it has got that OLED panel technology, and therefore means all the pixels can be switched off. So everything I've said so far is really enticing and super positive, and so it should be. However, there are certain limitations that you should be aware about, and that's just namely due to the fact that you've got an OLED panel, and therefore for people who are coming from a regular LCD, in other words an IPS TN or VA, there are just certain things that I thought I should highlight. Now, first off, of course, we've got the burn-in effect, which is something that plagues any sort of OLED across any sort of price point or indeed size. Now, in order to mitigate the overall effect, the manufacturers provide you a few different ways. So through the monitor's OSD, you can enable the likes of pixel orbiting, screensaver, logo protection, taskbar dimmer, boundary dimmer, and you can also enable a thermal protection. Now, there is also a pixel refresh, which will have to be done every so often. Thankfully, this can be done when the monitor goes into standby, therefore not giving you any sort of downtime. Worth considering in case you just want to completely switch off the monitor, worth looking at the amount of time that you had it on so that the pixel refresh can indeed do its job as it should do. Because if you do ignore it for a lot of time, and for example if you have the auto warning disabled, it will have to do it manually after roughly 16 hours of cumulative usage. Now, another thing I would also like to highlight is the fringing effect. Thankfully, over the older generation OLED monitors, this is pretty much a non-issue, namely due to the fact you've got a higher resolution and a relatively smaller form factor. For those people who are not aware, the fringing effect is effectively a slight different discoloration that can be found behind certain text and objects, and that's just due to the sub-pixel layout of OLED monitors and the way that Windows or operating systems are picking them up in comparison to LCD panels. Thankfully, as you'll be able to see from these images, it actually does do a tremendous job. And while using this monitor for gaming, multimedia consumption, and also writing, I had no problems whatsoever. Now, I would just like to point out that AOC do offer you a 3-year burn-in warranty, which is certainly very appreciated, therefore giving you a little bit more of extra peace of mind, at least in the first few years of your ownership. So with that out of the way, let's get on to the overall build quality. And here you've got a 3-side bullet design with a relatively thin bottom bezel. Indeed, this monitor has got a 26.5-inch form factor and therefore won't take up too much space on your desk. Now, its stand is actually very sturdy. It provides height, tilt, pivot and swivel adjustments. In fact, it can be rotated in both ways, which is very much appreciated. However, I'm not really fond of the asymmetrical design that AOC have gone for. It is actually aimed at more of the esports crowd, which doesn't really make sense with this product. I also just don't like it because of my OCD. But of course, if you don't like it like myself, you can replace it with a VESA compatible stand, allowing you to place it on a monitor stand itself or a multi-monitor setup. Now, at the back of the monitor, you might have noticed an RGB ring, and yes, it's pretty redundant. It's not bright, or nor does it have the capabilities of, for example, the Philips Ambiglow or Ambilight effect, and therefore means that, in all honesty, you'd probably want to disable it. That is actually very easily done because you can do it via the monitor's OSD, which can be accessed by a small little joystick button that's found at the back right-hand side of the monitor. Now, the monitor's OSD is super comprehensive and provides you all the right options that you'll require. And furthermore, you've got an extension to this via software via the AOC G menu. And here you can also check for future firmware updates, which can be handy if there are any sort of bug fixes that come into effect at a later date. Now, to conclude, I would like to talk about connectivity. And here you've got those two HDMI 2.1 ports. And you've got a singular DisplayPort 2.1 port with UHBR20, giving you good sort of bandwidth capabilities. Then you've got USB Type-C 3.2 ports, which will not only display something on the monitor itself, but also feedback power up to 65 watts. In other words, it's handy, for example, if you're connecting it up to a laptop. Speaking of which, over here, you have got two USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type A ports, handy, for example, for peripherals. And this is accessed via the USB Type B port, where you have got a Type B to Type A cable that's provided within the box. Then you've also got a headphone jack output via 3.5mm connection, And you've also got two 5-watt speakers built in. They'll suffice for your basic music or gaming needs, although if you want some superior audio fidelity, I'll suggest getting a separate solution. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict of the AOC Agon Pro AG276UZD. And hopefully I've highlighted throughout this review, I've actually been left really impressed. Indeed, there's very little negatives to actually draw upon, other than the fact that potentially the sRGB color accuracy could have been a little bit better tuned, and the 2.2 gamma clamp could have been a little bit tighter. Other than that, it really does tick a lot of boxes. It's got that 240Hz refresh rate and that 4K resolution with that smaller form factor of 26.5 inch, therefore giving you better sort of pixel density and overall text legibility. Then you've also got phenomenal response time and input lag, an excellent HDR reproduction, and support for the likes of adaptive sync technologies. Not only mentioning that, but you've also got a comprehensively laid out OSD, software, and the likes of USB Type-C connectivity, which can be handy if you're connecting up to a laptop. Given all of this, and the fact that it also undercuts its rivals, where at the time of filming and in the UK can be found for £600, it's an absolute no-brainer. And as a result of this, it easily gets my Best Buy awards. Now I'd be curious to know what you make of it down in the comment section below, and if you'd pick it over rival alternatives. As a reminder, if you do want to find it on Amazon, make sure you check out the links down in the description below or the pinned comments, or by scanning the QR code that can be found on your screen. Now, if you've enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing, and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.